This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show, as together we hear how they are making their world better. Hello, podcast listeners. Well, there is no doubt that words have power. Words create identity. Words can signify more than we realize. And the topic today we're going to have with this wonderful panel discussion is all about the nonprofit sector and the brand and literally the name nonprofit. If you've been following with me, you know that I've had a couple of good discussions about this. And in fact, this panel discussion we're bringing back together again. When we first had the panel discussion a couple of months ago, it was more about the topic of what are the biggest challenges facing the nonprofit sector and some of the biggest barriers and obstacles like staff retention and whatnot. In that conversation, we all talked about how we need to rebrand the nonprofit sector. And I said, you know what? This is a fantastic discussion. We need to have another opportunity at a separate time to bring you all back together and discuss this because it's a huge issue. And then if you've been listening to my podcast, I had John and Becky from We Are For Good on, and we talked about that at that particular interview. And the reason I mentioned that is I think this is something that is really resonating with people across nonprofits in the U.S., number one, but across the world. But specifically in the U.S. is our context, of course, where I'm at. And I think this idea of rebranding the nonprofit needs to happen. And so that is the focus of our attention in this discussion today. We've got the same crew back. It's a wonderful group of folks. And I'm really glad you've tuned in today. So real quickly, we have Gayle Smith, we have Joan Garry, Tony Martignetti, and Sara Lomelin. They're here together again as a panel talking about what is the brand that we should start moving into when it comes to the nonprofit sector? And why should we rebrand the nonprofit sector to begin with? Like, what is the root of this issue of the name nonprofit? That why do we need to change it? And then if we do change it, what do we change it to? What's a new name that we could kind of rebrand, if you will, this sector? Is it social impact sector? Is it social innovation sector? Is it the for good sector? So all that and more will be part of this wonderful discussion with these great leaders who are really making a difference. Thanks for tuning in today. I think you're going to enjoy today's episode. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Well, welcome everybody. I am so excited to have this panel discussion back again. And for my listeners, we had such a good time. And I know I got so many good comments from the last time we had this illustrious group together. In fact, we had to break it into two parts. But during that discussion, we talked about this issue of the branding of the nonprofit sector and the fact that maybe it's time for a rebrand. And so this prompted us to say, let's get back together. We had such a good time. And let's talk about another topic. And we're going to focus all of our time on this issue of the rebranding of the nonprofit sector. And so again, I want to start with this discussion. It's going to be one of those I think will be really fun to hear what each one of you have to say about this. But I thought maybe it's always good to find out, where did we start? How did we get here, in other words? And so let's start with that. How did we get here with this nonprofit name and this sector that has a branding that maybe is more about what we don't do rather than what we do? How did we get to this point where we are talking about what we're not rather than what we are, and why is this a problem? I'm going to have Joan Garry kick this off, and then the rest of you can chime in. So Joan, how did we get here? What's the history here?
So I've actually created my own history on this.
Okay, all right.
And I think it is because the do-gooders are so busy doing the good work that we allowed it to happen to ourselves, you see.
Okay.
And that this powerful and incredibly vital sector in our society became known by its tax exempt status. And I actually believe that this is a metaphor for how we talk about the work that we do, how we market it, about who we are as leaders, that, that we are so busy doing the work that we don't invest nearly enough time and energy and attention into marketing that work to others. And that has significant ramifications, as each one of your other guests will attest, right?
Right.
I just think it's fortunate that we didn't wind up becoming the 501c3s, which actually sounds like
could be worse.
some kind of a heavy metal band.
Sounds like a good band.
No, that's true. I love it. Thank you. Yeah, Gayle, what would you say to this one? How did we get here?
Look, I think Joan's absolutely right. And I think it is because of the tax status, which is something we want to advertise because it means that you can give us money and take a tax benefit from that. But it also, I think, as we all agreed last time, it defines us by what we are not. And, shorthand, you can look at it and say, it kind of sounds like a failed business.
Right.
But I think the other thing it doesn't capture is if you look at the profit-making sector, right? Their measure of success is, are they making a profit? Now, there are plenty of businesses that are entrepreneurs that go into business to solve a problem. There's a good intent, but still, their effectiveness, their success is measured by its ability to yield a profit. Our sector, I think, measures more our ability to affect change or have some sort of positive impact on society, but that's not in our name. Right. And I think that's one of the things, it puts us almost in a defensive, slightly apologetic. We're really sorry we're lesser beings.
Right.
And we're not like the big guys.
Yeah, don't mind
But
us.
we do
We'll
really good
just
stuff.
sit in the corner over here and eat dirt.
Exactly. So we know we're at the kids' table, and I think that's a real problem because I think, Joan's point, we're all very busy on it. This sector tends to attract people that aren't those that would knock over a grandmother to get in the photo. There's a certain, it's not about me.
Right.
But the problem is, if we're defined in this, here's what you're not, here's the do-gooders, the sort of patronizing pat on the head, we don't assert what we are. And I think in doing that, we kind of leave on the table this notion that what we do is good, as opposed to also including that what we do is right.
Good point.
Because if we are not changing the world in a positive direction, we're not just failing to be do-gooders, we're leaving the world in a position that is worse. So I think it kind of, I don't know, I feel like it contributes to an almost apologetic, we're not real somehow.
Okay.
Whether it's in the economy or in the overall landscape of how societies form and develop.
Yeah. Okay, Sara, you look like you're ready to chime in here.
Yes, no, I am totally agree with Gayle and Joan that it's such a tiny part of what we are, right? Yes, we're non-for-profit, but it's just a tiny part of what we do. It sounds weak. It sounds, just okay, don't mind them, as Joan said, here, it almost sounds like we just need a few crumbs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not the incredible power that we have, because literally what we are doing, what the sector is doing, is filling out all those gaps that governments and institutions are leaving open. Right.
I mean, not to mention, actually, Sara, the size of and the impact of the sector on the global economy.
Yes. Right.
Totally.
Great point.
And again, I feel that how you started, Joan, thinking we are too busy doing the good we rarely like the spotlight.
Yeah.
And we should embrace the spotlight a little bit more. Because there are so many, every time you talk to a nonprofit leader and you find the stories, the success stories of, their staff, the clients that they're serving, their communities are incredible. Why are those stories are not on the front pages of different papers, right? Because it's more important to know the sales of X corporation than to know, the impact that we're having in different communities. So we definitely need to change that.
Well,
Love it.
and I'll just add a quick point on that, Sarah, because I think when we are in the press, it's kind of feature stories about puppies, if you know what I mean. It's a
Right.
little, isn't, I mean,
if we're
to John's
actually,
point,
if we're lucky,
if we're lucky, but I think if you think about our share of the economy, if you think about what our ROI is, even the coverage when it exists is like, here's a really thoughtful, meaningful aberration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As opposed to here's something we should be investing in, not just donating to, but investing in.
I like that, Gayle. That's so true.
It's either the puppies, right? The bless their hearts kind of story, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, totally.
Bless their hearts.
Well, or it's
fraud.
a fraud story, which is very As I suspected, I'm less concerned about the moniker nonprofit than the other panelists. It's not ideal, I agree, but I think the likelihood of it changing seems minuscule. I want to agree that we do need to say more about the good work that we do, and I just think that falls to each individual institution.
Yeah.
To claim to among its constituents, volunteers, employees, donors, board, the good work that is getting done, which means the impact as opposed to the outputs, the impact. How are things changing because of the work that we are doing?
Yeah.
And again, I just think that falls to each institution, each nonprofit to be responsible to tell those good stories to the folks who are invested or might invest.
Yeah.
Tony, can I make a point about that? I feel the problem with that is that the big nonprofits, the big institutions will be the ones with the resources to do that, right? But so many grassroots, community-based organizations, I mean, they have a couple of staff that have, 20 different hats. They are not, and always, right? When there is less funding, the first thing that gets cut is marketing, is communications, is all these tools. So I do feel, and maybe that's something that we can discuss here, how everybody as a sector can help each other as a sector, right? Because otherwise, I feel that, again, the stories, when they cross outside of the usual, the usual outlets of our sector that we're preaching to the choir, are those, either the puppy stories or the big, huge nonprofit. It's very rare that we have the story of our small local nonprofit out there.
There is a problem. The media has difficulty, I think, covering the nonprofit sector, and that's why the Chronicle of Philanthropy, now that it's a nonprofit, soon to be acknowledged by the IRS, I'm sure, has a fellowship to bring journalists in from like ProPublica and from the Associated Press, the AP, to train. That's a worthwhile initiative, because I agree the media community has trouble covering the nonprofit sector. They don't really understand. It's more about social impact than other measures that they're more acquainted with in covering other constituencies. But Sara, in terms of the relative sizes, I mean, there's always going to be 20%, the largest 20% of the largest 20% of nonprofits probably control 80% of the nonprofit capital, or if those aren't the exact numbers, something lopsided like that. And I mean, this harkens back to a point that I made in our first discussion, which wasn't very popular, but I'll repeat it anyway. The risk of being derided by the panel, that it's a matter of operating like a business. There are enormously large businesses like Google and Facebook and Microsoft, and try to think of something that's non-tech, Delta Airlines, and there are always going to be those behemoths, but there's always also a place on the for-profit side for small startups, but it's for the small nonprofits. I think it's a matter of a business sense. learning how to be scalable. Maybe not cutting marketing and fundraising at the first instance. That I think is often a mistake. But leaning into the board, expanding even within your local community. Every nonprofit is not going to scale to national prominence, but
No.
but they, I think, with more, again, at the risk of being derided by the panel, more business orientation, not at the sacrifice of mission. I'm not saying we alter the sector to be a for-profit sector. Nobody's saying anything ridiculous like that. But more of a business sense, so that there is a sense of investment in marketing, investment in technology, and but just the passion is essential, but it's necessary, but not sufficient.
Okay. Or what do you think, Joan? You were about ready to say something.
So I think a couple of things, and I actually don't disagree with you in many ways, Tony. I actually think that nonprofit, there's so many different root causes for this, and I know that's a question that you have,
Right,
Rob.
let's dive into that. Yeah.
So you talk to many nonprofit leaders. The way I think of it is this: is that there are many nonprofit leaders that when they would submit a book report,
Okay.
they would not focus a whole lot of time on their cover. That the book report would stand for itself, and they would expect to get an A on their book report, right? And that there's something actually, and I was on a board of an organization that could have been quite good at marketing, but that there was a certain attitude about having to invest time in the book cover, if you will. So I think there's a certain bias against marketing.
Okay.
The second thing I just wanted to say is that I think marketing is essential to operating a nonprofit as a business in the way that you describe it, because but it also ties directly to my mission. Because if I actually do not have people, if I don't have volunteers, if I don't have people who mobilize, if I don't have people who donate, if I don't have a pipeline of board members, I have no power.
Yeah.
Good point.
Right. And so for me, there's many root causes, but at least one of them is that we see marketing as something that falls into overhead, when in fact it's a driver of programs. It's actually a program because you're building your army.
Okay. Gayle, you're going to chime in there.
That's scaling. That's
I don't disagree.
Thinking in terms of scale and growth, and it's not going to happen overnight. It might not happen even in 2 years, but I think you have a trajectory for growth.
I think we're talking about two different things. I think that nonprofits need to understand that marketing is one of your tools. It may be a program, Joan, as you suggest. Tony, there's no question that it's important and it's often discounted. I think what we're talking about here is the sector. Yeah. And I think it's a real problem that the sector is defined as it is, because it has no real meaningful definition for a couple of reasons. And I agree with much of what you said. I think that chances of this changing aren't in fact minuscule. Everybody I've talked to since we did that podcast who's in this space was like, oh my God, can we do this tomorrow? And I'm not sure it would be at all difficult to get the nonprofit community to start talking about itself in different language, to start using different language in its materials, and to start correcting people on podcasts when they say, so you want to run a nonprofit? No, actually, I run an X. Yeah. So I actually think that change is possible. And the reason I think maybe it's marketing, but the reason it's really important at a big picture level, we are seen as a community to which you can donate. So it's like an elective. Like if you're feeling nice, if you're feeling good, we do not think about this sector, as large as it is, as something to invest in. We invest in entrepreneurs. We invest in businesses. We donate to nonprofits. I think I look at a lot of nonprofits that do spectacular work. We don't think about investing in them because our assumption is their ROI. They don't make any profit. So you don't invest in something that makes profit. We've got to make clearer what our return is.
Yeah.
What do we leave on the table? That's number one.
Okay.
Number two, I think we're living in a time where if we don't start to see some radical social change, we can do another podcast that is like, what are you going to do with the 3 days that we have left on Earth or something? I mean, like the world is not going in the right direction.
Okay.
And this notion of change or filling gaps left behind by governments or institutions or people organizing into small civil society organizations or NGOs to have some agency over their lives, that's vital. And that's got to bleed in, quite frankly, much more into the sort of mainstream, if you will,
Okay.
rather than being this sort of cute, really nice sector of do-gooders on the side. I think it's vitally important because it speaks to how we think about how we are organized as communities and countries. Are we organized into the for-profit and the nonprofit?
Right.
No.
I totally agree with you, Gayle.
But I think it's a different point, Tony, than you're making, and I'm not disputing your point about individual NGOs and marketing. I'm looking at where we place value.
Yeah.
And we undervalue this sector because of the way it's understood.
And it sounds like you would say, Gayle, the stakes are higher than ever. Is that, would you say, Gayle, that you feel like the stakes are going?
The stakes are really high. I think we should do it.
Yeah. I love it.
I think that's allowing the moniker nonprofit to define us rather than
it does define us.
Rather than us defining ourselves. Well,
but Tony, I think I would really disagree with you here. I think that when I talk to a room full of...
But
okay,
please,
one at a time. Tony, go ahead. Finish your thought.
The idea of donating versus investing. I think, I know I write a lot of copy for nonprofits because I do planned giving, fundraising, consulting. Mm-hmm. And I use the word invest often. And I encourage clients to think of constituents as investors. So, I don't want the moniker to be the method through which we define ourselves just because we have this unfortunate moniker. We can use language, and when I say we, I mean individual nonprofits can use the language that they prefer when they're talking to their constituents, and the moniker be damned. We have channels to talk. We have channels to talk to our constituents, and we use the language that is best for us. And I would absolutely agree. Investing, we're investing in the future. We're investing in our work. Yeah,
I feel that's exactly what we're talking about.
Okay, Sara, go ahead. We'll give it to Sara real quick. Sara, your thoughts on this?
No, I think that's exactly what we are doing here, right? It's like, yes, we should start with ourselves. Yep. Changing that language and change. And I think, like you, Gayle, I think the change is possible because if you think about it in other ways of using language, right? Mm-hmm. When we started, talking about the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community, like, the using of pronouns, I feel that us, the social sector, the nonprofit sector are at the vanguard in many ways of using language in a more equitable and progressive way. So we can do it. We can do it as a sector. And totally, as you're saying, Tony, it starts with each nonprofit talking to your constituents and also, a lot of donor education, right? Like we were saying last time, like how do you, I used to work for the Latino Community Foundation and we always said like, change, not charity. We want change, not charity.
I like that.
How do we change that? Because charity sounds like, okay, here, here are 3 pesos for you. And change is like, I want an investment. I don't want your change. I don't want your change in terms of like your little...
Sure, yeah.
You get
your investment.
You get what you're saying.
Okay, so let's dive into this. What do we call ourselves then? You want to jump in, Joan? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I was kind of digging the 501c3s, but I didn't.
You're like
I don't see that getting a whole lot of traction.
Any other thoughts?
Well, the social impact.
Social impact.
It's about social impact.
I
think
work.
that is.
We have social impact investors now that we didn't have 10 years ago.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good name.
Yep.
Again, I I don't think we should be defined by the name, but if we're going to change it, I'm not going to fight the hypothetical question. Yeah, the social impact sector, because that's what you should be reporting. Again, versus contrasting outputs, which is okay, but that may be more, that's more an internal number, I think, than internal metric than your impact. What change have you seen?
Right.
Not how many backpacks did you produce, but how many kids graduated from high school
well said.
who got the backpacks versus the graduation rate pre your work.
Yes.
That's an impact. So
that's right.
Yeah, I like social impact investing. And there's you get investing in too.
There you go. That's right. Double. No, it's great. Okay. Other thoughts on naming? I do think the social impact, it's out there. People use it already. A lot of corporations obviously have a social impact director maybe, or a social impact arm. So it does seem like that's in the kind of language we're using already. Any other thoughts about something that highlights what we do better than nonprofit?
Well, I was actually just going to ask the group, actually, what are other, besides, right? What does this sector, if you started with a blank sheet of paper, right?
Yeah, right.
Like what are the key words that define what this sector is all about? I mean, clearly change is one of them. What else? Are there other words that come to other people's minds?
Right.
I mean, this is about change in society. We're making the world, sort of moving the world in a better direction. Like, what other words come to your minds? I'm curious.
I kind of threw out that social innovation. I wonder if that resonates with you all. It's not just social change, but innovation, really thinking that nonprofits ought to be on the cutting edge of innovation, of making, change happen in their various communities. And I think that's a positive thing right now. People want innovation. They want that to be something that they invest in, going back to investing. But what do the rest of you think? Does that capture what do you think our sector is all about?
So I would just jump in and say that I don't think our sector does nearly enough innovation. I don't think we deserve that word yet.
Okay. All right. That's fair.
No, I think that's right. And because, look, the nonprofit sector is vast and diverse, and some of it is gap filling, some of it's quite innovative. I mean, to me, the keyword is change.
Okay.
Social obviously is a helpful descriptor. I think Tony's point on impact is a really good one, because it gives you the sense, both change and impact give you the sense that there is something that comes out of the work that this sector does. Right? It's there's some return on it, and it may not be dollar profit, but it is something else.
What else? Yeah. Sarah, do you have something? Or Joan, another thought?
Yeah, one other thought. I mean, so I don't think you need to hire a PR firm here, right?
Okay.
So having run an LGBT organization for a decade, just think about how language has changed over time in the LGBT community, right? So, first we were heterosexuals and homosexuals, and then gay and lesbian became the way you described the community. And now we have, letters, a growing number of them, I might add, right? That will actually probably continue to grow to such a point that it will actually be very hard for many people to actually understand what this community is. But that didn't happen because someone hired Edelman to say, let's come up with a happy word like gay. It happened because activists within the LGBT community actually took this on and said, no, homosexual, it defines only a particular aspect of who we are as people. And they fought for a change. And then organizations, sort of like the one I led, would then go to the media and say, here's a guide about how to cover gay issues. And, in the late 1990s, it was, no, we don't want to be called homosexuals. Here's a guide to how to talk about gay issues in the media, right? And you just, it becomes a process over time. So I guess it happens in some ways, Tony, what you were describing is it happens because the organizations sort of get mad as hell and can't take it anymore because they're being defined by something that they do not choose to be defined by. And they do that. And then they actually syndicate it by advocating to press and other places. and it kind of gathers steam that way. I mean, that's at least my experience with the LGBT movement.
Interesting.
I like any idea that embraces the movie network. So that's
so as long as it's connected to that, you're good.
I don't know if others caught that.
Movie quotes. You never go wrong with movie quotes.
Her reference to "Mad as Hell and Can't Take It Anymore" is from the movie network.
I love it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the possibilities. Maybe I'm just being a little more. I don't know. I think realistic. Others might say pessimistic, but most realists are often called pessimists. Just realistic optimists, but yeah, the change can take place. And look, I don't even like that the New York Times still hyphenates the word fundraising. And that's like from the 1940s. 1940s. Right. I wanted to start a petition campaign to just have fundraising be one word.
That's
or how about
one hyphenated word,
possessive rather than plural.
Yeah,
right. Or about how about the most recent, my wife reads the real hard copy of the New York Times every morning. And above the fold, the last story on nonprofits in the last 2 weeks, above the fold was about the CEO of the National Association of Realtors out on his ass for sexual harassment. Right.
Oh, wow.
That's what the New York Times chooses to put above the fold.
That's just a professional association. Doesn't really.
My God. Yeah.
Sadly, doesn't even define the vast majority of nonprofits. It's a professional membership. No, but
it does for those readers because
it does for the
readers. I know but what do readers know?
Right.
Sarah, journalism has trouble covering us, the third sector. Look, in the UK, we're called the third sector.
That's right. You're right. In the UK, exactly.
Well, that says even less.
Right.
If you can't be number one, then you don't want to be
third.
First sector is good. Any sector below that.
Hello from the last sector.
So, and let's talk about undescriptive. Third sector.
Sarah, I feel like I interrupted you.
Yeah, Sarah's going to say something. Jump in, Sarah. What do you think on this?
No. I just wanted to add that, for example, one of you mentioned fundraising, right? Like, the hyphen, which is from, I don't know how many years ago. And right now, right, there is this new trend of it's not fundraising, it's resource mobilizing, right? Yes, so it's like how you start tweaking and understanding different ways of doing the same activity, but, through a different lens, right? Yeah. So I do feel, I'm an optimist, but I do feel that, just in the last 10 years, language in our sector has changed a lot and continues to evolve, right? So I do think it's possible.
Yeah. And okay, so we've talked around this. Yeah, go ahead, Gayle. You have one more thought on that?
I was just going to add, I think one of the other pieces to this, I mean, Tony, you said, you don't want the moniker, the name just to be the thing that drives all this. I think you're right. And I think the question is, what has to accompany reframing or rebranding this sector?
Yeah.
Because to me, for example, I went to a big conference just as the pandemic ended, even though we're in a surge now. And I had recently been at the State Department leading that effort and then back at a nonprofit. It's on a panel, and it's a huge, very well-known annual conference with a lot of powerful people.
Okay.
And there were two panels on the pandemic and what it means for the world. And one was CEOs, huge, big names, very powerful people. And the other panel was entirely nonprofits.
Okay.
And it was very much like the grown-ups table and the kids table. And I went back to the organizers and they said, that was great. We hope you come back next year. And I said, no, I'm actually not coming back next year unless you mix this up a little bit. Because what you're telling attendees is that if you want to listen to the really powerful people, kind of the authorities, you go to this panel. And if you want to listen to the do-gooders, you go to this panel. And respectfully, the CEOs they talked about knew a lot about the impact on its business, but they didn't know a whole lot about pandemics or anything else. And I think it's like the thing that's been done with panels and manels and people refusing to do panels unless they're more diverse. I think there are things like that where if we want to be taken more seriously, we've also got to be a bit more assertive. I don't mean aggressive, I mean assertive, and kind of presume that we're not at the kids' table, but we're at the grown-ups' table.
Right.
And so anyway, I think something accompanies the change in language.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is donorbox.org. Hey friends, and thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I want to let you know that I've recently become a professional certified coach. With my nearly 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard you work as a leader. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on to get help with the barriers, the leadership challenges that you will face both professionally and personally. And I really want people to thrive, to become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. So if coaching is something you've always been interested in, but maybe weren't quite sure what it was all about, I encourage you to reach out. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or just email me at rob@robharder.com. I would happy to provide a free sample coaching session so you can determine if coaching is for you. All right, thanks again for tuning in. Now back to the show. That's a great segue. I was going to ask that question of how do we move this conversation along? What's the process of changing? Sara, what else would you say, picking off of what Gayle said?
Yeah, no, completely. And even, even within our sector, right? We're putting together a collaborative summit in next month in San Francisco. And it's a global summit, but, of course, global summit, but, 80% of the people are from the US, right? So how do we make sure, to highlight those voices from the global South so it doesn't, no one feels that is the kids' table. And, it takes a lot of thoughtfulness and asking people. And as Gayle said, the way we are being proactive about that is literally co-designing the whole content with the attendees. Because
Sara,
otherwise, sorry.
Can I ask a challenging question?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah.
Why didn't you choose to host it in the global South, somewhere in South America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile?
It was a time constraint. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to do it like that. It's the very first time that something like this is happening. So, but definitely for next year, we are going to be doing it outside of the US. But to answer your question.
Yeah, I went to a conference a few times that was deliberately hosted in a small town in Mexico. It wasn't Mexico City or Cancun, or it was, I can't even remember the name of the town. But you had to connect to get to you had to connect through one of the big cities to get to their little airport. And I feel bad that I can't remember the name of the town. But so what's the bigger lesson from that? That each of us individually, and I think this goes back to what I was saying, we each make a series of decisions.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about marketing decisions and language and promotion decisions around how we message, but where you host, if you're new to the nonprofit sector, where do you organize? Where do you incorporate?
Yep.
If you have the wherewithal to expand, which I know a lot of organizations don't, but if you do, where do you put your second office? Maybe it's still in your state, but maybe it's in a underserved town in your state where your work can be done, which makes it a little more challenging for you, but you're making a bold statement. So, we all make these individual decisions that over time can affect change. Okay. And I think, and then parallel with that, what Gayle was recommending, that, we all speak up and we have the opportunity. So if you're talking to a conference like you were, Gayle, you make your dissatisfaction known. You're talking to a journalist, you're talking to a congressional panel, a congressional committee, whatever. We over time we can affect change. I just want to recognize that it takes a lot of time.
Okay.
I think that's right. I think another thing that might be interesting that I have found is a technique and a lot of things I've been involved in that are about change is coming up with like 5 or 10 facts that would surprise people. Joan, I'm thinking about your reference to like the guide for the media.
Yeah.
And I think I don't have them all on hand, but I think if you aggregated some of the data about what the nonprofit sector does or delivers, even in a given sector.
Yeah.
How many kids are able to go to school because of the nonprofit sector? We years ago did something where we looked at how many Americans there are and in what states that give money to nonprofits. And it's a huge number. I mean, how many supporters are there of the nonprofit sector? You can look at the percentage, what's the gender balance, and like everywhere else, it's a bit of an imbalance, although there's some really fascinating stuff in terms of small nonprofits and gender. But the point would be, what are 5 points that if you're talking to a journalist or you're on a panel or you're sitting in front of a bunch of potential donors or investors, what are some points that can be made that would convey to people, A, this sector is much bigger than I ever anticipated. B, it has much more public support than I ever knew.
Right.
And 3, the tangibles of what it delivers are on par. I mean, if you look at I ran the U.S. Government Development Agency. If you look at what that USAID puts on the table, but you look at what nonprofits in the humanitarian and global development space put on the table, in the aggregate, this sector is a big player. It's as big as a government in many cases if you aggregate it. So I wonder whether there couldn't be a way to just have some of those factoids at hand that I always call them nuggets that cause people to say, oh, wait, maybe I should listen a little harder to what you're saying.
Right.
Aren't we 1/10 of the GDP of the nation?
Yeah.
And
I've been told that. Yes, 1/10.
Correct. Around 16 or 17 trillion. So we're 1.6 to $1.7 trillion sector.
That's huge.
Oh, there's a case statement of facts that are undeniable in terms of the vitality and the power and the way in which the sector drives our economy that you just can't deny. I mean, I think part of what you're talking about here, Gayle, reminds me of how often we talk to ourselves.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So here we are on a nonprofit podcast, and who is listening?
Yeah.
Nonprofit.
Nonprofit
I mean, I have a podcast as well. Tony has a podcast, right? Who listens to our podcasts, right?
Right.
I'm actually currently on a full court press to find my way onto podcasts that are not in the sector, to talk about the sector as the antidote for what people are really looking for in this world, which is meaning and purpose.
Right.
Right. And like here we are, all nonprofit organizations, for the most part, have a serious scarcity mindset, and yet actually have the thing most people actually really want and need in their lives.
Yeah.
And yet sit here.
Okay, and I applaud what you're doing, Joan, reaching outside the sector, absolutely. But inherent in what you're saying is the responsibility of each nonprofit to tell its story, tell its impact. And I don't care if your mailing list is 750 people. You tell your story to those 750.
Sure.
You reach out to them as best you can. And to your point, Gayle, if you only have 2 staff members, you're constrained about how you can reach out. But who can you leverage? Can you leverage your board? Can you leverage can you bring in a volunteer? If you bring in 1 part-time volunteer, maybe you go from 2 staff members to 2 1/4 staff members. You've just increased by 1/4 of 2.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, Tony.
25% or something like that. So I applaud what you're doing. That's a very good idea, Joan, going outside the sector and
Love it.
speaking up about the sector. That's exactly in line with what we were saying earlier. But we have a responsibility to help the institutions within our sector to help themselves as well.
Maybe it's a both and. Go ahead.
I have to tell the epilogue, that little allegory that I just told about the conference that went to deliberately in a very small town in Mexico. You had to do a 20-minute connecting flight from the nearest major airport to get to it.
Right.
They compromised. They gave in to the U.S. interests because too many Americans were complaining that they couldn't get direct flights because they had to make this connection to this conference, and the conference caved in. They sacrificed what they stood for, and they started hosting in Cancun, where lots of Americans can, and this was a global conference, by the way, where lots of Americans can get direct flights to Cancun, but they couldn't get them to this other small town that I can't remember the name of. And that's when I stopped. And this is a parenthetical. It's not a testimony to me. When I stopped going to the conference, when they collapsed on what they said they believed in and started hosting in Cancun so that the rich American interests didn't have to change planes in Mexico City. The point is, don't sacrifice. That's a tragic epilogue to that organization and that conference that they caved in.
Yep.
So don't give in on what is in your mission and your values and just, what you believe in.
Yep. Hey, that's a great segue. We only have a few minutes left. What I'd love to have you each share is, we're getting to this, but for my listeners that are mostly nonprofit leaders, that as far as I can tell, but what can they all do collectively? Each one of you have a very large platform, but each one of them have very important platforms. As you said, Tony, whatever, if it's 750, it's 25. If it's 7,000, they have a platform too. What advice would you give to them that are listening to say, hey, this is going to take all of us to really make this a new rebrand, if you will? What advice would you pass on to my listeners? Again, maybe Sara, you could start, and then each one of you will have an opportunity to speak to this.
The first one is don't beg. Don't make yourself little. Be assertive, right? Like don't be asking for, little crumbs. Like I feel that each of us in our own, constituency can talk about the impact and the importance of our work.
Yep.
And the more we educate our, donors, supporters, investors, volunteers, staff, people in the community, the better we'll be known and the better we'll be, recognized. And as Gayle said, right, like if you have an opportunity to talk to a journalist, even in your tiny local paper, be sure that you are not making yourself small.
Oh, I like that. That's good. Good. Gayle, what would you add to this? Advice you'd pass on?
I really like that. Yeah, it's like totally own it and tell the story about the change that you make. I really like, Joan, what you just said is that the kind of work that most nonprofits do is about meaning and purpose, right? It's mission driven. And that's a tangible to people if you can explain it. Two other things I'd say is use different language. Talk about yourself as a social change organization or social impact or something other than non-profit. If that comes up, give people examples that always tell them a story or give them an example. And I think, Sara, I love what you said about don't let yourself be small. Don't apologize, right? Lean in and talk like you're at the adults table because you're supposed to be at the adults table.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
this isn't an elective on the sideline. This is a necessary, vital part of what needs to happen in our country or community for all of us.
Love it. Good. Okay. Joan, what do you think?
I guess I have a couple of things. First, invest time and energy in developing a culture of storytelling in your organization.
Yeah.
Nonprofit leaders are actually historically not actually very good at it. We do storytelling workshops in our nonprofit leadership lab for thousands of leaders in North America and around the world.
Right.
And we talk about that as being central to your ability to invite people to know more and do more for your organization.
Right.
The second thing is I would start to educate your board. And I would actually encourage you to turn them into storytellers and ambassadors, right? Just to Tony's point.
Yep.
You actually have to build this whole internal posse of ambassadors, right? And if you can't tell a good story, you certainly can't tell it to a journalist, right?
Well said.
I would also say that it's time for us to really start to educate funders that marketing is an essential component of the work a nonprofit does. You would not have a for-profit business that didn't have a marketing department. I mean, I came out of strategic planning in the for-profit sector.
Okay.
We had a robust strategic planning department, not too many of those in the sector. So really starting to think about marketing as an essential component of what the organization does.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I would say is, it is time to get out of the business of just thinking that if I send a press release, someone will cover my organization. That it is time to actually build, nurture, and cultivate relationships with journalists who cover your issue, and give them something they need, right? Suggest a story to them that may or may not include you. You might want to be a pull quote in that story.
Yeah.
But actually, you can get an intern to create a media database of the folks who cover your particular sector. And you can actually begin to get to the point where those folks start to call you.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of things. And then when they call you, you actually can tell a good story. They might actually write about you.
Nice. Oh, I like that.
Amen, Joan.
Love that. All right, Tony, maybe one last thought. What would you say? The advice you want to pass on to the listeners?
Don't be humble.
Yeah.
Don't talk to your constituents about any of your work, not just when you're appealing for volunteers or fundraising. We talked about Sara was on my podcast, talked about the 5 T's. Let's see if I got it. Time, treasure, talent, testimony, and ties. Testimony and ties. Those are the 2 that a lot of people leave out. So when you're asking for the 5 T's that credited to Sara, do it with confidence, not with humility.
Right.
You deserve, as we've all said, you deserve a seat at the adult table. You are at the adult table. Ask with confidence, whichever of the 5 T's you're asking for. Just to take Joan's advice one step further, you build those media relationships, and I would go beyond journalists, podcasters, web bloggers, maybe other social influence folks, but you could leave those out. That could be a mixed bag. You build those relationships now before you want to start telling your story, so that when something does arise in your sector, like Joan said, ideally the person calls you, but if not, you can remind them that this is your work, because maybe your relationship is only 6 months old and they didn't know you. But it's just like building fundraising relationships. You build relationships with, let's call them media outlets, and you can lump in there whatever you like, whatever's appropriate for where you are. But you build those relationships now, so that when you want to tell a story, the person already knows you. Just like when you want to invite someone to the gala, they already know you. You're not asking out of the blue, out of the cold. So be confident, build relationships among all the constituents that can help you.
No, well said.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes, one last thought. You got it, Sara. You get the last word.
Did I say be humble? I meant don't be humble. Did I just say be humble?
No, you said don't be humble. You did.
Okay, I said don't be humble.
We got it.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Sara. I'm sorry.
Collaboration.
Oh, good. Yes.
Do not, do not think at other social impact organizations near you as competitors, but collaborate with them.
Yes.
We're stronger together is not a cliche. Share ideas, share contacts. If I know a journalist and you have a story, I'll give you the name, open doors to each other, and you will have a stronger sector in your community.
Yeah. Well, love it. Well, again, Sara, Joan, Gayle, Tony, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Love this discussion. Very lively. And again, my listeners, you've got a charge here. There's a lot of things that have been shared today, and it really does start with each one of us making a difference. But again, to my panelists, thanks for taking time. Thanks for all you do to really make this sector a much better sector. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for taking time to be on the show.
Thank you for having us, Ron.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, friends. Well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep making your world better. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Go to YouTube and look up Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. We'll see you there. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.